I looked at my father across the dining room table. His face flushed the color of the cranberry sauce nobody had touched, and for the first time in 28 years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel the familiar pull to apologize for something I hadn't done. I just felt tired. "You will withdraw that paper by Monday morning," he said, his voice doing that thing where it stayed quiet but his hands trembled. "You will issue a public retraction. You will tell the dean it was a misunderstanding. And then you will sit down with your brother and figure out how to fix this." My mother nodded beside him, mascara already starting to run, dabbing at her eyes with the cloth napkin she'd ironed that morning. The same napkins she ironed every Thanksgiving, the same Thanksgiving I'd flown home for, dragging my suitcase through Reagan National in 45 minutes of rain on I-66 because she'd called me crying 3 weeks ago saying the family needed to be together this year. I should have known. I really should have known. My name is Eleanor Brassfield, and I was a senior associate at a research hospital in Boston when my parents tried to destroy my career on Thanksgiving night to protect the family golden boy. That golden boy was my older brother Trent, 31 years old, who'd been sitting silently at the end of the table the whole time staring at his plate like the green bean casserole held answers. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. I grew up in Vienna, Virginia, in one of those houses with a brick walkway and a wreath on the door no matter what season it was. From the outside, we looked like a Pottery Barn catalog. Inside, we ran on a different system. There was Trent, and then there was me, and the two were not equal currency. Trent was the firstborn son. Trent was the one who got the bigger bedroom, the new car at 16, the second-tier college tuition fully paid when he didn't get into anywhere first tier. Trent was the one whose middling grades got framed and whose D in calculus got blamed on his teacher. When Trent got caught shoplifting at the Tyson's Galleria when he was 15, my father drove down personally and had a conversation with the manager, and somehow the whole thing disappeared. I was the daughter. I was the backup plan. I was the one who got the hand-me-down everything, who paid my way through undergrad at Virginia Tech on a scholarship and 3 jobs, who never made my parents proud enough to get a fridge magnet of my report card. I learned early to stop wanting things. Wanting things from my parents was like asking a vending machine for a hug. When I got into Johns Hopkins for my PhD in molecular biology, my mother said, "That's nice, sweetheart. Did you hear Trent got a promotion?" When I published my first paper in a peer-reviewed journal at 25, my father said, "When are you going to do something practical, like your brother?" Trent, by the way, had been an assistant marketing director at a series of companies, each of which he left under unclear circumstances. Always someone else's fault. Always. But here's the thing nobody tells you about being the invisible kid. You become very, very good at noticing things. You learn to read rooms. You learn to predict what's about to happen. You learn that information is the only kind of power that nobody can take from you. By 28, I had a postdoc position at one of the most prestigious cancer research centers in the country. I was working on a project that, if it panned out, was going to change how we treated a certain class of pediatric tumors. I'd been first author on 3 papers in the last 18 months. My PI was already talking about putting me up for a faculty track position. My parents knew almost none of this. Whenever I tried to tell them, my mother would change the subject to Trent's latest girlfriend or his struggles with his difficult bosses. She'd send me articles about how women in their late 20s without husbands had a harder time conceiving. She'd ask if I'd thought about freezing my eggs. She would not, under any circumstance, ask about my research. About 8 months before this Thanksgiving, something started to bother me. Trent had gotten a job, finally, at a small biotech firm in Reston. He didn't have a science background, of course, but he was in their business development office. I remember thinking it was a strange fit. He had a marketing degree from Radford and a personality that mostly consisted of complaining, but the pay was good. The pay was apparently very good, because suddenly Trent was driving a new Audi and my mother was bragging on the phone about how he'd taken her to the Capitol Grill for her birthday. Then my mother let slip, in one of those phone calls where she barely lets you get a word in, that Trent's company was about to do something big and that people were going to make a lot of money. She didn't elaborate. She rarely did when it came to anything substantive about his life. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was busy. I had grant applications. I had a paper in review. I had a life. 3 months later, I was at a conference in San Diego and I happened to share a hotel shuttle with another researcher from a lab at NIH. We got to talking, the way you do, and somehow my hometown came up, and the small biotech world came up, and she mentioned that her brother-in-law worked at a company in Reston that had just gotten itself into a real mess. It was Trent's company. Of course it was Trent's company. Of course it was Trent's company. I didn't say anything. I just listened. And what she described, in pieces, over the course of a 40-minute shuttle ride, was that her brother-in-law had quit because the senior leadership was misrepresenting their clinical trial data to investors. They had a Series C funding round coming up. They needed the data to look better than it was. So they were just, making it look better. I went back to my hotel room that night and I couldn't sleep. I want to be very clear about something. I am not a snitch. I am not someone who looks for fights. If Trent had been working in marketing at a paper company, I would have wished him well and never thought about it again. But this was different. This was a company developing a drug for sick people. Children, in some indications. And if they were lying about their data, real patients were going to get hurt. I went home from San Diego. I tried to forget about it. I really did try. But I knew people. That's the thing about being in a research community for almost a decade. You know people. And over the next 2 months, I gently, carefully made some inquiries. Nothing illegal. Nothing close to it. I read public filings. I looked at the trial registry on the federal database. I cross-referenced what the company was claiming publicly against what their actual clinical endpoints had been. And I found things. I found a lot of things. In late August, I called Trent. I told myself I was being a good sister. I told him what I'd found in vague terms, and I told him that I was worried about him. I asked if he knew. I asked if maybe he was being used. I asked if there was any chance at all, that I was wrong. There was a long silence on the phone. Then he laughed. "Ellie," he said, using the nickname I hated. "Don't be such a goody two-shoes. Everybody does this stuff. It's how the industry works. Mind your own business." I asked him to please consider what he was saying. I asked him to think about who got hurt if the drug didn't work the way they claimed. I asked him if Mom and Dad knew what was going on. "Of course they don't know the details," he said, his voice tightening. "And they're not going to know, and neither is anybody else. Are we clear?" We were clear. I hung up. I sat on my apartment floor for a long time and stared at the wall. I didn't sleep much for about a week after that. I talked to a colleague at the medical school I trust completely, off the record, without naming the company. I talked to my best friend from grad school who was now at the FDA, also off the record, also without specifics. And I thought about it. I thought about it for a long time. Then I did what I had to do. I drafted a letter to the FDA. I included publicly available information, cross-referenced with what I'd been able to verify through legitimate channels. I did not include anything Trent had told me. I did not name him. I simply laid out the discrepancies I'd identified and asked the agency to take a look. I sent it in early October. I didn't tell anyone in my family. What I didn't know, what I would only learn later, was that the FDA was already looking. Another whistleblower, an internal employee, had filed a complaint 2 months before mine. My letter just added another data point. But the wheels were already turning. The day before Thanksgiving, the news broke. Not a huge story, not yet, but it was on Stat News and Endpoints and a few financial sites. The company was under federal investigation for potential securities fraud and clinical trial misrepresentation. Their stock cratered. Their CEO was on administrative leave. The Series C funding was frozen indefinitely. I read it on my phone in the security line at Logan Airport. I should have turned around right there. I should have flown back to Boston. I should have made up an excuse, a sudden flu, anything. But my mother had been so insistent. She'd called me 3 times in the past week. She'd said the family needed this. She'd cried. I got on the plane. By the time I landed at Reagan, I had 3 missed calls from my mother and a text from my father that said only, "We need to talk when you get here." The drive from the airport felt like driving through fog even though it was a clear November afternoon. I rolled into Vienna right as the sky was turning that pinkish gray it does in late fall. The wreath was on the door. My mother had used the cinnamon broom in the foyer like she did every year. The whole house smelled like turkey and sage and something underneath it that I didn't want to name. Trent was already there. He looked terrible. He'd lost weight. His eyes were red-rimmed and he wouldn't look at me when I came in. We made small talk through cocktails. We made small talk through the appetizers. My mother served the turkey with shaking hands and didn't comment when my father poured himself a third glass of wine before we'd even started eating. It was after the pumpkin pie that my father set down his fork and said, "Eleanor, we know it was you." I set my own fork down. What was me? Don't play games, the FDA thing, the investigation. Trent has told us everything. I looked at Trent. Trent looked at the green bean casserole. I waited. Your brother is going to lose his job, my father continued. He may face personal legal consequences. He may face fines. And it is because of you. It is because of your meddling. It is because you couldn't just let your family alone. I didn't say anything yet. I was watching my mother. She had her hands pressed to her face. She was crying very softly. "He is your brother," my father said. "He is your brother," my father said. "He is your blood," and you stabbed him in the back. I waited a beat, then I said I sent the FDA publicly available information about a company that was misrepresenting clinical data to investors. The drug they were developing is for sick children. If that drug had been approved on fraudulent data, children would have been hurt. I didn't stab anyone. I did my job as a scientist. "You're not the FDA," my father snapped. "No," I said quietly. "I'm a citizen with a conscience. They don't only take complaints from employees. You will retract it," he said. "Monday morning, you will call them and tell them you were mistaken." "That's not how it works," I said. "You will find a way to make it work." "I won't." That's when my mother started really crying. Big, gasping, performative sobs. The kind I've been watching her do my entire life when she wanted something. "Eleanor, please," she choked out. "He's your brother. He's our son. Your father and we co-signed his apartment lease, do you understand? If he loses his job, if there are fines, we are on the hook. We could lose everything. Your father is 63 years old. We can't start over." I felt something move in my chest. Not sympathy exactly, something more like nausea. "You co-signed for a 31-year-old's apartment?" "That is not the point," my father said. "It's a little bit the point. You will retract that complaint," he said, leaning forward. "Or you can consider yourself no longer welcome in this family. You can consider us no longer your parents. You can find yourself completely alone. Is that what you want? Is that what you want, Eleanor?" I looked at my father. I looked at the man who had never once come to my graduations, who had skipped my dissertation defense to attend Trent's company's holiday party, who had told me once at 12 years old that I should smile more if I wanted to be likable. I looked at my mother, who had spent 28 years explaining away her son's failures and minimizing her daughter's wins. And I looked at Trent, who finally lifted his eyes and met mine. He looked desperate. He looked hopeful. He looked, just for a second, like the kid who used to share his Halloween candy with me before he learned he didn't have to. I felt sorry for him. I want that on the record. I felt genuinely, painfully sorry for him. But not sorry enough. "All right," I said. My father's shoulders dropped about an inch. My mother let out a half laugh, half sob. Trent's mouth started to form something. Gratitude, maybe, or just relief. "All right, what?" my father said carefully. "All right," I said again. "I'll consider myself no longer part of this family." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. It pressed down on the table, on the half-eaten pie, on the candles my mother had lit for ambiance. "Eleanor," my mother whispered. "I'm not retracting anything," I said. "I'm not going to lie to a federal agency to protect a man who knowingly participated in fraud that endangered sick children. I won't do it. I am sorry that you co-signed his lease. I'm sorry that you spent 31 years preparing him for a world that was always going to catch up with him. But I'm not going to set my career on fire and obstruct a federal investigation to give him a few more months of cover. I won't." "You ungrateful." My father started. "I'm going to finish, please," I said, and something in my voice must have surprised him because he actually stopped. "I came here tonight because I thought you wanted to spend Thanksgiving together. I thought maybe, for once, we were going to be a family. Instead, you tried to coerce me into committing a crime to protect someone who committed a different crime. Do you understand that what you're asking me to do is also illegal? Do you understand that you're sitting at this table asking your daughter to commit a federal offense for her brother?" "Don't be dramatic," my father said. "I'm not being dramatic, I'm being literal." I stood up. I folded my napkin and set it on my plate. "I'm gonna get my bag. Eleanor, sit down." "No. Eleanor, your father is talking to you." I heard him. "I'm done now." I went upstairs. My old bedroom was a guest room now, painted a color my mother called agreeable gray. I picked up my suitcase. I hadn't even unpacked. Some part of me, I think, had known. When I came back down, all three of them were still at the table. Trent had finally moved. He was hunched forward with his face in his hands. "You can't just leave," my mother said. "I really can," I said. "It's Thanksgiving night," my father said. "Where are you going to go?" "I have a rental car. I'm going to drive to a hotel." "I have a rental car. I'm going to drive to a hotel. Tomorrow I'm flying back to Boston. If you walk out that door," my father said, "don't bother coming back." I looked at him. I felt the strangest thing. I felt sorry for him too. He looked so old suddenly. He had spent his whole life building a son who was going to be the family legacy, and the son was a fraud and a coward, and now he was watching the backup daughter walk out of his house knowing he had no leverage left. He had nothing. He had played his last card and it was a joker. "I wasn't planning to," I said. I drove to a Hampton Inn off the toll road. I didn't cry. I sat in the parking lot for a while with the engine off and I watched my breath fog up the windshield and I waited for something to break inside me, but it didn't. I felt clear. I felt the way you feel after a really long hike when you finally take your boots off. I checked in. I took a hot shower. I ordered a turkey sandwich from a 24-hour diner down the road and I ate it sitting cross-legged on the bed watching a college football game I didn't care about. My phone rang twice. My mother both times. I let them go to voicemail. Around 11, Trent texted, "Please call me." I didn't. The next morning I flew back to Boston. The sky over Logan was that crisp, cold blue you only get in late November in New England. I took the tea back to my apartment in Cambridge. I made coffee. I sat by the window and I called my best friend Rosa, who knew everything, and I told her what had happened and she said, "I'm proud of you, Ellie." It was the first time in a long time anybody had said that to me. The next few weeks were hard. I won't pretend they weren't. My mother left a series of voicemails that went from grieving to furious to grieving again. My father sent one email, very short, with the subject line "disappointment." I didn't read it past the first sentence. I deleted it. Trent did not contact me again. I learned later, through a cousin who was the only person in my extended family willing to speak to me, that Trent had been let go from the company in early December. He was named in the federal complaint that came out in February. He took a plea deal. He didn't go to prison. He got 3 years of probation, a fine he couldn't pay, and a permanent mark on his record. My parents took out a second mortgage to cover the fine and his legal fees. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt mostly sad, for them, for Trent, for the version of our family that had never existed except in my mother's Christmas card photos. Here's what I want you to understand though. Here's why I'm telling you this. 6 months after Thanksgiving, I got an email from the dean of the medical school. My faculty track position had been approved. I was offered a 10-year stream appointment with a startup package that included 2 postdocs, a technician, and lab space I had genuinely dreamed about since I was a kid, building potato batteries in our basement in Vienna. 2 weeks after that, I got a call from a journalist at ProPublica. She'd been working on a piece about whistleblowers in the biotech industry. She'd found my name through court documents. She wanted to talk. I almost said no. Then I thought about it. I thought about every parent of a sick kid who might have been given a drug that didn't work because nobody wanted to make the phone call. I said yes. The article came out the following spring. It was long and careful and good. My parents didn't read it. I know because my cousin told me. My mother had banned the family from mentioning my name at all, but other people read it. I got emails, a lot of emails, from other young scientists who'd seen things and didn't know what to do, from parents of sick children, from 2 different members of Congress, from a woman in Ohio who said she'd been the invisible kid in her family her whole life, and reading my story made her feel like she could finally breathe. That last one made me cry, actually. I read it 3 times. About a year after Thanksgiving, my mother called me. She got my voicemail. She left a message that I listened to twice. She said she had been thinking. She said maybe she had made some mistakes. She said she missed me. She said my father was not doing well, that he had been diagnosed with something he didn't want me to know about, that he would never call me himself, but that he had asked about me last week. She wanted to know if I would come for Christmas. I didn't call her back right away. I sat with it. I talked to my therapist who I had finally started seeing 6 months earlier. I talked to Rosa. I talked to the woman who is now my girlfriend, a pediatric oncologist named Imani who had patients like Deepwater. In the end, I called my mother back. I told her I wasn't coming for Christmas. I told her I was glad she was reflecting, and I hoped that work continued. I told her I was sorry to hear about my father. I told her that if she wanted a relationship with me going forward, that was going to take time, and it was going to require some real conversations, and it was not going to happen because I felt guilty enough to show up. I told her I loved her, which was true and complicated, and that I hoped she'd take care of herself. She cried. I let her cry. I didn't apologize for anything. I didn't promise anything. When I hung up, Imani was sitting on the couch with a cup of tea waiting for me, and she didn't ask anything. She just patted the cushion next to her, and I sat down and put my head on her shoulder. I'm 31 now. The lab is going well. The pediatric tumor work is in human trials, the legitimate kind. I bought a small condo in Somerville with the savings I built up, never relying on my parents for a single thing. I see my mother twice a year in carefully bounded visits. My father and I are not speaking, and I have made my peace with the possibility that we never will. Trent and I have not spoken since that Thanksgiving. I think about him sometimes. I hope he's okay. I hope he found a way to grow up. I don't know if he did. If you're listening to this and you're the invisible kid, the one whose wins didn't matter, whose pain didn't register, who was raised to make yourself small so the favorite could feel big, I want you to hear me say this. You don't owe them a lie. You don't owe them your career, your reputation, your future, your conscience. You don't owe them a Thanksgiving where you sit at the table and let them coerce you into protecting the person who hurt you both. You owe yourself a life. You owe yourself the truth. And someday, if you're lucky, you'll sit on a couch with someone who loves you, with a cup of tea you didn't have to ask for, and you'll realize that the silence you're hearing isn't loneliness. It's peace. It took me 28 years to learn the difference. I think about that Thanksgiving more than I expected to. Not the way you replay a fight in your head, picking it apart, wishing you'd said something sharper. I think about it the way you think about a door you finally walk through after staring at it for 28 years. Every choice I made that night had a reason behind it, and every reason had a root that went back decades. When I sent that letter to the FDA, I wasn't betraying my brother Trent. I was honoring 1,000 quiet moments I'd never been allowed to honor before. Every time I'd watched my parents excuse his behavior. Every time I'd swallowed an apology I didn't owe just to keep the peace at dinner. Every time I told myself my conscience was a luxury I couldn't afford in this family. The bill on all of that came due eventually. It always does. What I've come to understand is that doing the right thing rarely feels like winning in the moment. It feels like loss. It feels like sitting alone in a Hampton Inn parking lot on Thanksgiving night, watching your breath fog up a rental car windshield, wondering if you just set fire to the only family you'll ever have. The reward, if it comes later, quietly, in the form of a phone call from a journalist, in an email from a stranger in Ohio, in the steadiness of a woman named Imani who hands you tea without asking what's wrong. I want to say something to the person hearing this who recognizes themselves in my story. Being decent is not the same as being agreeable. Being smart is not the same as being clever enough to game a system. And being strong is not about how loud you can yell or how hard you can hit back. The hardest thing I ever did was sit at that table and say "all right" with a calm voice while my chest was on fire. That kind of strength is built in the boring years, the years nobody claps for, the years you spend learning to trust your own perception when everyone around you is telling you the sky is green. My brother had the easier road, and it broke him. I had the harder road, and it built me. There's a lesson in there that nobody in my family was willing to learn, and I had to stop waiting for them to catch up. If you take one thing from what I've told you, take this: your character is not your family's property. They didn't give it to you, and they can't take it back. The work of becoming a person of integrity, a person who thinks clearly, a person who keeps walking forward even when the people who should have loved you best are screaming at your back, that work belongs to you alone. Do it for yourself. Do it for the kid you used to be, the one nobody noticed. The peace on the other side is real. I promise you it is real. And it's waiting.